The war in Kashmir in 1947 was quickly spreading in all the three fronts, with the Indian armed forces trying to push back the invaders on all of them. The Srinagar highway, along the Nowshera-Poonch communication line, and up north along the Gilgit-Skardu route. This video walks you through the details of the war from the perspective of the town of Leh. Colonel Thapa, who was posted in Leh in October of 1947 at the beginning of the war, left north with his troops for the town of Skardu in an attempt to try and strengthen the defenses of the town. For the details of India's campaign in the north of Kashmir, please watch the previous videos in the series. After Colonel Thapa left with his troops, Leh was left with just 33 men for its defense. Leh was a town deep inside the Indian territory and had the towns of Skardu and Kargil as buffer regions before it could even be threatened. In order to increase the town's strength, on March 8, 1948, Srinagar ordered two Dogra to go on foot to strengthen the defense of Leh. Their objective was to raise and train local militia at Leh to make the defense more reliant on the local population rather than the regular Indian armed forces. With this, more regular troops could be made available for the campaigns in other regions. By April of 1948, 50 locals had been trained to support defense activities of Leh. They were on track to raise enough local militia in the coming weeks and months to make the defense of Leh self-sustainable. Everything was going as planned in the efforts of defending Leh when an event happened up north that dramatically changed the equation for the town. May 10, 1948. The enemy's surprise attack outflanking the towns of Sonmarg, Dras and Kargil came into effect. Even though the towns of Sonmarg was able to push back the attacks, Dras and more importantly Kargil fell to the invaders. So in one quick succession, Leh, that initially had the protection of three buffer towns and a secure supply line for reinforcements, was suddenly vulnerable from enemy attacks and completely isolated from the Indian strongholds in Kashmir. Despite the commendable efforts by the troops at Leh to set up its defense, the troop strength present at Leh and the resources available with them were not enough to sustain the defense of the town for very long. The town needed to be reinforced with troops and supplies urgently, otherwise Leh was all but lost. Leh could be reinforced by the Indian side through three ways. First, through the Srinagar-Kargil-Leh highway. This highway was the easiest and the fastest way to continuously reinforce Leh. The Indian side was banking on this option, but with the loss of Dras and Kargil, this line of communication was broken. The Indian side would have had to take these areas from the enemy first in order to supply Leh. Second was air support. Without the highway, the alternate way was to reinforce the town by air. Leh did not have any airstrips yet. The troops had to first prepare an airstrip for the Royal Indian Air Force Dakotas to land in order to supply Leh with troops and resources. To make matters even more difficult, the weather in the area was bad too often, making this option of reinforcement unreliable at best. The third and the final way was an untested route through the cold mountain from behind Leh via Manali. There was no route that existed through this way so far. If this way was to be used, the Indian side would have had to create a route from this direction that would eventually be used by the Indian troops as an option for reinforcement. This was through a very challenging and mountainous terrain. While all these options were explored, the defense of Leh was left up to the small number of troops present there. Their objective was to hold off the enemy assaults until one of the three options pan out and more troops arrived to strengthen the defense of the town. Leh was isolated and extremely vulnerable, that could fall at any time. May 17, 1948. Colonel S.B. Singh and Major Coutt's sugar column that had dispersed just before Skardu made it to Leh. This somewhat helped build the troop strength, although this relief was only temporary, because a few days later, a big disaster happened in the defense of Leh. On May 22nd, the enemy attacked a crucial bridge in the outskirts of Leh. At this bridge, the Indian troops had put strong defenses to stop enemy advance. During the assault, the Indian troops guarding the bridge suffered heavy casualties and were forced to retreat. They destroyed the bridge before withdrawing from their positions to slow the enemy's advance further. The enemy now was just 1 or 2 attacks away from storming into the town. The troops at Leh, with the help of the local civilian population, were working on building a temporary airstrip to enable air support to start coming in. It was successfully completed with the means available. It was still too risky for the Dakotas to land on this trip. This, along with bad weather, made the aerial route not a reliable option for reinforcing Leh in the long term. The Indian side started planning Dakota sorties to Leh. They also started planning operations from Sonmarg to take back Dras and eventually Kargil. And as a far-fetched Plan C, the Central Command ordered scouts on an exploratory mission to find a path from Manali through the rough terrain into Leh. So the basic plan was to reinforce Leh by air until the Srinagar-Leh highway could be opened up again. All this along with the Manali-Leh option as a shot in the dark. Meanwhile, on May 22, 1948, the troops at Leh, after taking into account their numbers and resources, concluded that they could only sustain the defense of Leh for just 2 more days. That is, until May 24, 1948. They requested immediate air support and reinforcements to be provided to them latest by May 24th. There was no other option for the Indian side but to risk sending their Dakotas and the troops in it to reinforce Leh. May 24th was extremely bad weather, and no Indian pilot had ever attempted a trip like this. To fly in such high altitude and bad conditions and then land on a makeshift airstrip that had just recently been completed. Royal Indian Air Force most senior flying officer, Air Commodore Meher Singh, took up the task to fly the Dakota in these challenging conditions. He was able to fly through the conditions and successfully land in Leh. This provided the much needed relief in the troop strength and resources to the defenses there. Another set of reinforcements were promised for May 26th, but the weather took a turn for the worse and no further reinforcements could be provided for the next 5 days. With no reinforcements available in Leh after the first trip, the troops started to get dispirited, which increased the chances of desertion in the ranks. The officers decided to pull back all their troops from the outskirts of Leh into the main town to strengthen the defense of the town as one strong unit. Meanwhile, the base at Srinagar started planning out troop deployments to strengthen defenses in Sonmarg, which was to be used as a base to launch attacks into Dras. As for the Manali-Leh link, the first column of Indian troops was dispatched from Manali towards Leh. The column had 6 officers and 151 soldiers along with some local guides. This was under the command of Major Hari Chand. As mentioned before, this was a very treacherous, onerous trek and would take the column weeks to months to reach Leh, if at all they were successful. The enemy at this time was just 27 kilometers away from Leh and was about to launch their first major assault into the town. It seemed like this was the final stand for the defense force at Leh. With no reinforcements available in Leh after the first trip, the troops started to get dispirited, which increased the chances of desertion in the ranks. The officers decided to pull back all their troops from the outskirts of Leh into the main town to strengthen the defense of the town as one strong unit. Meanwhile, the base at Srinagar started planning out troop deployments to strengthen defenses in Sonmarg, which was to be used as a base to launch attacks into Dras. As for the Manali-Leh link, the first column of Indian troops was dispatched from Manali towards Leh. The column had 6 officers and 151 soldiers along with some local guides. This was under the command of Major Hari Chand. As mentioned before, this was a very treacherous, onerous trek and would take the column weeks to months to reach Leh, if at all they were successful. The enemy at this time was just 27 kilometers away from Leh and was about to launch their first major assault into the town. It seemed like this was the final stand for the defense force at Leh. This is when, after 5 days of extremely bad weather, the weather cleared just enough for Srinagar to be able to fly a reinforcement of 6 officers and 77 troops of Gurkhas into Leh on May 30th, 1948. The enemy launched their attack into Leh on June 1st, and the additional troops available in the battlefield gave the defenders at Leh just enough strength to have a fighting chance to push back the assault. The enemy was pushed back the same day. It is interesting to note that it was very likely that the enemy would have taken Leh on May 22nd if they had just pushed harder after their initial success. But for some reason, they chose to wait and regroup. This gave the Indian side the much needed breathing space for setting their defenses, consolidating their forces, and the arrival of 2 iterations of reinforcements from Srinagar. Minor skirmishes continued in the outskirts of Leh in the first 3 weeks of June 1948. More reinforcements could not be sent out to Leh via air during this time, as they had to be directed to protecting Sonmarg from constant enemy attacks, as well as operations in Naushera region also needed troop deployment. Radio communication with the scouts via Manali were also lost during this time, with the chance that the expedition force was stalled, lost, or even worse, perished on the way. After the initial crisis at Leh on May 22nd, there was a second crisis there on June 26, 1948. The enemy had taken a couple of weeks to increase their strength in the outskirts of Leh, and with the strength of 600, they attacked Leh on June 26th. The defenders had received some reinforcements in May, but a lot of their supplies had been depleted during the skirmishes in the past few weeks. The reserves were enough to only slow down the enemy, not enough to push them back from taking Leh. The defenders were very well dug in and fought wave after wave of enemy assaults at their positions. The troops, after suffering constant assaults, were overstretched trying to defend their positions and requested air support. But air support could not be provided due to really bad weather all week. The defenders kept on fighting and pushing back the enemy assaults from their positions throughout that week. Despite all efforts being made by the defense forces, it seemed that by the first week of July, they would be overrun by the enemy. Leh was about to fall. The officers at Leh sent communication to Srinagar requesting reinforcements to avoid capitulation. Unfortunately, there were no good options for Leh at this time. Things were looking very bleak in Leh. That is when a miracle happened. The expedition force from Manali that had lost radio contact with the center found its way through the snowy mountains and reached Leh from the rear. The expedition force, led by Major Hari Chand, reached Leh on July 5th, 1948. This was no less than miraculous, considering the timing of their arrival. They reached Leh exactly when all options for them had been exhausted. These reinforcement troops had arrived from an avenue that had the least probability of succeeding out of all the three options. With this development, there was still hope for the Indian Defence Forces in saving Leh. Major Harichand and his troops quickly moved to the front and supported the defence efforts of the town. The enemy meanwhile accumulated around 1,000 troops around Leh for their next attack, while 200 regular troops and 200 militia were defending it from being taken over. Srinagar could not provide any more help from their side for at least 4 weeks, so troops at Leh were on their own for now. With no further expectation of reinforcements for a month, the defenders changed their tactics of engaging with the enemy. Instead of waiting for the enemy to attack them, they decided to take the fight to the enemy. This was using small, low-risk targeted raids in the enemy strongholds. The plan: take advantage of the element of surprise and cause attrition in the enemy and raise the troops' morale. July 18, 1948. This theory was tested by attempting multiple parallel raids in enemy camps. This turned out to be a very successful strategy because with this, the enemy halted their attack plans in an attempt to better organize their defenses. The fighting continued through July and the first 2 weeks of August. The troops at Leh, due to lack of reinforcements in the last 5 weeks, were again running short of ammunition, were at a point where the enemy's bigger numbers were close to overwhelming the defense positions. August 14, 1948. This was the fall of Skardu, a major setback for the Indian side. With the fall of Skardu, Gilgit, Skardu, Kargil and Dras were all lost to the enemy. Leh was the sole pocket in the north and the east holding strong against the constant assault from the enemy. The Indian side now focused all their efforts in supporting Leh with whatever they had. Dakotas were sent in on August 15th and 19th with supplies and ammunition for the defense. August 23rd, 6 officers and 58 troops were flown in to increase the strength of the defense at Leh. Between August 23rd and August 30th, 350 more troops reached Leh from the newly created Manali-Leh track. And on August 30th, 123 more troops were flown into Leh. With this, there was significant force present at Leh, and it was very difficult for the enemy to take it. With more force present at Leh now, the Indian side could not only successfully defend Leh, but also could go on the attack against them. September 6, 1948. This was the first time the Indian Armed Forces planned a surgical strike deep into enemy territory. This was led by Major Harichand. The objective of this operation was to go deep into enemy territory and locate the enemy's 3.7mm howitzer guns that were causing havoc for the Indian defenses, destroy those guns, and safely return to the base. Major Harichand selected his best 35 mountain climbers, got some ammunition and some dry rations for them to eat, and some mountain gear. The commandos left Leh on September 6th, trekked through the bad mountains and snowy terrain non-stop for 3 days, reached deep into enemy territory on September 9th, located the enemy howitzer gun teams, waited for the nightfall and attacked the teams in the night, taking out all the howitzer gunners and destroying all howitzer guns over there. The team, with the objective achieved, came back to Leh through the same path and reached base on September 15, 1948. The success of this surgical operation proved the efficacy of such strikes to be used in future. The enemy made multiple attempts to take Leh, but all attempts were pushed back by the Indian side. At the same time, it was not strong enough to push the raiders out of the region. Stalemate was setting in at Leh. The Indian plan now was to utilize their strength at Srinagar to push the enemy from Zojila, Dras, and Kargil. If the Indian side was able to do that, the enemy at Leh would be encircled from both the sides and would have no option but to retreat. So, Leh's objective was to continue with the stalemate status quo, and the Indian troop movements from Srinagar would take the aggressive stance. And as soon as the Indian troops take Kargil, both Kargil and Leh would launch simultaneous attacks on enemy positions, routing them from the region. The plan looked good on paper, but for its success, the enemy strongholds at Zojila Pass, Dras, and Kargil had to be broken. To make matters worse, this task had to be completed before winter sets in by mid-November. Because after the winter set in, it would be very challenging for the Indian side to conduct operations in that region. The troops from Srinagar and Sonmarg had made 2 prior attempts at breaking through in Dras and Kargil in June, but had failed. The Indian side made an attempt to take Zojila on September 2nd, 1948. The plan was to attack at multiple enemy positions simultaneously, catch them by surprise, and push them out. Timing and accurate intelligence on the enemy positions were very crucial for this operation's success. Due to incomplete information on enemy positions in Zojila, some teams made contact with the enemy earlier than the rest, and the element of surprise was lost. They were not able to push the deeply dug-in enemy back. The enemy knew the importance of keeping Zojila Pass and had made all the preparations not to give up their positions. The Indian side made the next attempt at taking Zojila on September 13th with the objective of taking all important features around the enemy positions and then using those features to push the enemy out of Zojila. The attack went in but ended in a fiasco. The enemy pinned down the Indian troops attempting to capture the features. The Indian side suffered heavy losses with 23 killed in action and 67 wounded and had to retreat from their positions. So 2 attempts had been made in taking Zojila Pass in September itself, and both had been unsuccessful. The winters were quickly approaching, and it was crucial to take Zojila, Dras, and reach Kargil before mid-November if the Indian side wanted to secure Leh. The strategy of leveraging infantry movements along with air support had failed multiple times. This was a time for some creative problem solving for the Indian military strategists. The planners came up with a creative yet highly risky plan. This plan was to bring in tanks into the battlefield in that region. This was a highly risky plan because tanks had never been used at such altitude and cold weather in Kashmir, and there was no way of knowing whether the Indian tanks would be able to perform as expected in these trying conditions. And even if tanks functioned at those temperatures, there were no tracks available for the tanks to even roll in. The Indian side would have had to first build the tracks before any tanks could be even used. The tracks would need to be built under enemy threat, and the last mile to the enemy would have to be traversed without a track. And in case that was not enough, adding another level of complexity to this plan, all this was to be accomplished in total secrecy. This means that building the tracks as well as transporting the heavy tanks into the region, all was required to be done in secret. The enemy, under no circumstances, could know that the army was planning to deploy tanks on the battlefield. Otherwise, in response, they would arrange for anti-tank equipment from their supply routes and deploy them to thwart the attack. The surprise, if achieved, would have to be a major achievement, since any major tank deployment or tank track building would be easily noticeable for the enemy informers in the region. Despite all the potential pitfalls with this plan, it was the best chance that Indian side had to break the enemy's triangle of Zojila Pass, Dras, and Kargil. If they were able to achieve all these conditions required for the tanks to roll in as a surprise, that would give a very high likelihood of victory for the Indian side. The operation was given the green light with the code name Operation Bison. The Indian side launched Operation Bison to push back the enemy from Zojila, Dras, and Kargil to relieve Leh. The first step for this operation was diversion. In a typical bait and switch style, the Indian side started troop movements and small skirmishes with the enemy as a diversionary tactic. The plan was to focus the enemy's attention on these skirmishes, making them believe that another attack may be coming in at those positions. All the while, the army engineers built the tank tracks into the battlefield. The army engineers started building the tracks and bridges on the route from Srinagar to Zojila as close as possible to the enemy positions. And for the tanks, the Indian side had to hide the tank movements from the informers present in the region. So they dismantled the tanks, camouflaged the pieces, and moved them using different routes and varying modes of transport into Sonmarg. The hope was that with the movement of tank pieces through different routes, no one will be able to connect the dots on this, and the plan to bring tanks into the battlefield would remain a secret until the very end. All resources from the Air Force were made available for this high priority operation. All the tracks and bridges were prepared for tanks to move in by October 15, 1948. The tanks were also assembled and all ready to go at Sonmarg. There was no way to know whether or not surprise had been achieved before the launch of Operation Bison. If the enemy was found to have implemented anti-tank measures, that would indicate that the surprise element was lost and the objective would be all the more difficult to achieve. The Indian side was ready to launch Operation Bison on October 22, 1948. The attack was all set to go in when a snowstorm hit the region, and all major troop movements and operations had to be halted till the weather got better. November 1st, 1948, the weather and tracks cleared up and the Indian side launched Operation Bison. This was the time for the reality check. The tanks moved ahead on the tracks. No anti-tank measures were found on the tracks. The element of surprise had been achieved. The enemy was found completely shocked with the presence of tanks in the assault, and they were quickly routed from their dug-in positions and were forced to retreat. The retreat of the enemy was also not made easy by the Indian side, where the infantry units chased the enemy to ensure the complete rout and keep the momentum going. The Air Force constantly bombing enemy positions during their retreat as well. Within the next few days, Dras was taken in a similar fashion, and by November 24th, the final assault of Kargil was completed with the Indian retaking of Kargil from the enemy. With Kargil in Indian control and with Leh having strong numbers present with them, the Indian side launched simultaneous attacks on enemy positions between Kargil and Leh. The enemy, surrounded by both sides, quickly fled the battle scene, leaving all the stockpiled ammo behind. With this, Operation Bison was successful. A lot needs to be said about the grit and determination of the troops of the Indian campaign in the north, especially in Skardu and Leh. The troops fought off enemies larger in numbers and better equipped for such a long duration. The defenders of Leh in the beginning were just 33 in strength. They trained local militia to strengthen their defenses, made a makeshift airstrip for the Dakotas to land, and held off the enemy to buy enough time for reinforcements from Manali or by air to arrive. In the end, when there was parity of numbers with the enemy, they showed superior strategy and tactics, and with the help of Operation Bison, they were able to rout the enemy from the crucial towns east of Srinagar. In the end, a UN brokered ceasefire was declared on January 1st, 1949, where India had taken back 2/3 of the region and Pakistan had 1/3. This was the moment in the war where Indian strength had increased in all the regions, and it was in a place to engage with the enemy from a position of strength. Plans were laid out for operations to commence in spring of 1949, but the UN brokered ceasefire halted these plans. The Indian armed forces fought off a determined enemy militia in higher numbers to protect Kashmir from invasion. With ever-changing scenarios during the war, the Indian armed forces were able to quickly adapt and achieve their objectives. The soldiers on the field went above and beyond to perform their duties.